The Story of Civilization, Volume 4, The Age of Faith, Part 1, by Will Durant, continued, Cassette 10, Side 1. Let us take, as an example of many Sufis, the saint and poet Abu Sa'id ibn Abil Khair, who lived from 967 to 1049. Born in Mayhana, in Khorasan, he knew Avicenna. Story has it that he said of the philosopher, "What I see he knows," and that the philosopher said of him, "What I know he sees." In his youth he was fond of profane literature, and claims to have memorized 30,000 verses of pre-Islamic poetry. One day, in his 26th year, he heard a lecture by Abu Ali, who took as text the 9th verse of the 6th surah of the Quran. "Say Allah, then leave them to amuse themselves in their vain discourse." At the moment of hearing this word, Abu Sa'id relates, a door in my breast was opened, and I was rapt from myself. He collected all his books and burned them. The first step in Sufism, he would say, is the breaking of inkpots, the tearing up of books, the forgetting of all kinds of knowledge. He retired to a niche in a chapel of his home. There I sat for 7 years, saying continually, "Allah, Allah, Allah." Such repetition of the holy name was, with Muslim mystics, a favorite means of realizing fana, passing away from self. He practiced several forms of asceticism, wore the same shirt always, spoke only in dire need, ate nothing till sunset, and then only a piece of bread, never lay down to sleep, made an excavation in the wall of his niche or cell, just high and broad enough to stand in, often closed himself within it, and stuffed his ears to hear no sound. Sometimes at night he would lower himself by a rope into a well, head downward, and recite the entire Koran before emerging, if we were to believe the testimony of his father. He made himself a servant to other Sufis, begged for them, cleaned their cells and privies. Once, whilst I was seated in the mosque, a woman went up on the roof and bespattered me with filth, and still I heard a voice saying, "Is not thy Lord enough for thee?" At 40 he attained to perfect illumination, began to preach, and attracted devoted audiences. Some of his hearers, he assures us, smeared their faces with his ass's dung to gain a blessing. He left his mark on Sufism by founding a monastery of dervishes and formulating for it a set of rules that became a model for similar institutions in later centuries. Like Augustine, Abu Sa'id taught that only God's grace, not man's good works, would bring salvation, but he thought of salvation in terms of a spiritual emancipation independent of any heaven. God opens to man one gate after another, first the gate of repentance, then the gate of certainty, so that he accepts contumely and endures abasement and knows for certain by whom it is brought to pass. Then God opens to him the gate of love, but still he thinks, "I love." Then God opens to him the gate of unity. Thereupon he perceives that all is he, all is by him. He recognizes that he has not the right to say I or mine. Desires fall away from him, and he becomes free and calm. Thou wilt never escape from thyself until thou slay it. Thyself, which is keeping thee far from God, and saying, "So-and-so has treated me ill, such a one has done well by me," all this is polytheism. Nothing depends upon the creatures, all upon the Creator. This must thou know, and having said it, thou must stand firm. To stand firm means that when thou hast said one, thou must never again say two. Say Allah, and stand firm there. The same Hindu Emersonian doctrine appears in one of the many quatrains dubiously ascribed to Abu Sa'id. Said I, "To whom belongs thy beauty?" He replied, "Since I alone exist, to me. Lover, beloved, and love am I in one, beauty and mirror and the eyes that see." There being no church to canonize such heroes of ecstasy, they received the informal canonization of popular acclaim. And by the 12th century the Quranic discouragement of the worship of saints as a form of idolatry had been overwhelmed by the natural sentiments of the people. An early saint was Ibrahim ibn Adam, possibly 8th century, the Abu ben Adem of Leigh Hunt. Popular imagination attributed miraculous powers to such saints. They knew the secrets of clairvoyance, thought-reading, and telepathy. They could swallow fire or glass unhurt, pass through fire unburnt, walk upon water, fly through the air, and transport themselves over great distances in a moment's time. Abu Sa'id reports feats of mind-reading as startling as any in current mythography. Day by day, the religion that some philosophers suppose to be the product of priests is formed and reformed by the needs, sentiment, and imagination of the people, and the monotheism of the prophets becomes the polytheism of the populace. Orthodox Islam accepted Sufism within the Moslem fold and gave it considerable latitude of expression and belief. But this shrewd policy was refused to heresies that concealed revolutionary politics or preached an anarchism of morality and law. Of many half-religious, half-political revolts, the most effective was that of the Ismaila. In Shia doctrine, it will be recalled, each generation of Ali's descendants to the 12th was headed by a divine incarnation or imam, and each imam named his successor. The 6th, Jafar al-Sadiq, appointed his eldest son Ismail to succeed him. Ismail, it is alleged, indulged in wine. Jafar rescinded his nomination and chose another son, Musa, as 7th imam, this circa 760. Some Shiites held the appointment of Ismail to be irrevocable, and honored him or his son Muhammad as 7th and last imam. For a century these Ismailites remained a negligible sect. Then Abdullah ibn Qadda made himself their leader, and sent missionaries to preach the doctrine of the Seveners throughout Islam. Before initiation into the sect, the convert took an oath of secrecy and pledged absolute obedience to the Daid Duat, or Grand Master of the order. The teaching was divided into exoteric and esoteric. The convert was told that after passing through 9 stages of initiation, all veils would be removed. The talim, or secret doctrine, that God is all, would be revealed to him, and he would then be above every creed and every law. In the 8th degree of initiation, the convert was taught that nothing can be known of the Supreme Being, and no worship can be rendered him. Many survivors of the old communistic movements were drawn to the Ismaila by the expectation that a Mahdi or Redeemer would come, who would establish a regime of equality, justice, and brotherly love on the earth. This remarkable confraternity became in time a power in Islam. It won North Africa and Egypt and founded the Fatimid dynasty. And late in the 9th century it gave birth to a movement that almost brought an end to the Abbasid Caliphate. When Abdullah ibn Qadda died in 874, an Iraqi peasant named Hamdan ibn al-Ashrat, popularly known as Karmat, became the leader of the Ismaili sect, and gave it such energy that for a time in Asia it was called, after him, Karamita, the Karmathians. Planning to overthrow the Arabs and restore the Persian Empire, he secretly enlisted thousands of supporters and persuaded them to contribute 1/5 of their property and income to a common treasury. Again, an element of social revolution entered into what was ostensibly a form of mystical religion. The Karmathians advocated a communism of both property and women, organized workmen into guilds, preached universal equality, and adopted an allegorical, free-thinking interpretation of the Koran. They disregarded the rituals and fasts prescribed by orthodoxy and laughed at the asses who offered worship to shrines and stones. In 899, they established an independent state on the west shore of the Persian Gulf. In 900, they defeated the Caliph's army, leaving hardly a man of it alive. In 902, they ravaged Syria to the gates of Damascus. In 924, they sacked Basra, then Kufa. In 930, they plundered Mecca, slew 30,000 Muslims, and carried off rich booty, including the veil of the Kaaba and the Black Stone itself. The movement exhausted itself in its successes and excesses. Citizens united against its threat to property and order, but its doctrines and violent ways were passed on in the next century to the Ismaili of Alamut, the hashish-inspired assassins. 6. Literature. In Islam, life and religion had drama, but literature had none. It is a form apparently alien to the Semitic mind. And as in other medieval literatures, there was here no novel. Most writing was heard rather than silently read, and those who cared for fiction could not rise to the concentration necessary for a complex and continued narrative. Short stories were as old as Islam or Adam. The simpler Muslims listened to them with the ardor and appetite of children, but the scholars never counted them as literature. The most popular of these stories were the fables of Bidpai and the 1,000 Nights and a Night. The fables were brought to Persia from India in the 6th century, were translated into Pahlavi, and thence in the 8th century into Arabic. The Sanskrit original was lost, the Arabic version survived, and was rendered into 40 languages. Al-Masudi, who died in 597, speaks in his Meadows of Gold of a Persian book, Hazar Afsana, or Thousand Tales, and of its Arabic translation, Auf Layla wa Layla. This is the earliest known mention of the 1,000 Nights and a Night. The plan of the book, as described by Al-Masudi, was that of our Arabian Nights. Such a framework for a series of stories was already old in India. A great number of these tales circulated in the Oriental world. Various collections might differ in their selection, and we are not sure that any story in our present editions appeared in the texts known to Al-Masudi. Shortly after 1700, an incomplete Arabic manuscript, not traceable beyond 1536, was sent from Syria to the French Orientalist Antoine Galland. Fascinated by their whimsical fantasy, their glimpses of intimate Moslem life, perhaps by their occasional obscenity, he issued at Paris in 1704 their first European translation, Les Mille et Une Nuits. The book succeeded beyond any expectation. Translations were made into every European language, and children of all nations and ages began to talk of Sinbad the Sailor, Aladdin's Lamp, and Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves. Next to the Bible, itself Oriental, the Fables and the Nights are the most widely read books in the world. Literary prose in Islam is a form of poetry. The Arabic temperament was inclined to strong feeling. Persian manners made for ornate speech, and the Arabian language, then common to both peoples, invited rhyme by the similarity of its inflectional endings. So literary prose usually rhymed. Preachers and orators and storytellers used rhymed prose. It was in this medium that Badi al-Hamadani, who died in 1008, wrote his famous Maqamat, or assemblies, tales told to various gatherings about a wandering rapscallion with less morals than wit. The peoples of the Near East were ear-minded, as were all men before printing. To most Moslems, literature was a recited poem or narrative. Poems were written to be read aloud or sung, and everyone in Islam, from peasant to caliph, heard them gladly. Nearly everyone, as in samurai Japan, composed verses. In the educated classes, it was a popular game for one person to finish in rhyme a couplet or stanza begun by another, or to compete in forming extempore lyrics or poetic epigrams. Poets rivaled one another in fashioning complex patterns of meter and rhyme. Many rhymed the middle as well as the end of a line. A riot of rhymes scurried through Arab verse and influenced the rise of rhyme in European poetry. Probably no civilization or period, not even China in the days of Li Po and Tu Fu, nor Weimar when it had 100 citizens and 10,000 poets, ever equaled Abbasid Islam in the number and prosperity of its bards. Abul Faraj of Isfahan, who lived from 897 to 967, toward the end of this age, collected and recorded Arabic poetry in his Kitab al-Aghani, or Book of Songs. Its 20 volumes suggest the wealth and variety of Arabic verse. Poets served as propagandists and were feared as deadly satirists. Rich men bought praise by the meter, and caliphs gave high place and fat sums to poets who turned for them a pleasant stanza or celebrated the glory of their deeds or their tribe. The Caliph Hisham, wishing to recall a poem, sent for the poet Hamad, who luckily remembered it all. Hisham rewarded him with 2 slave girls and 50,000 dinars, or $237,500. No poet will believe the tale. Arabic poetry, which once had sung to Bedouins, now addressed itself to courts and palaces. Much of it became artificial, formal, delicately trivial, politely insincere, and a battle of ancients and moderns ensued in which the critics complained that there were great poets only before Muhammad. Love and war outbid religion as poetic themes. The poetry of the Arabs, this would not be true of the Persians, was seldom mystical. It preferred songs of battle, passion, or sentiment. And as the century of conquest closed, Eve overcame both Mars and Allah as the inspiration of Arab verse. The poets of Islam thrilled with auto-intoxication in describing the charms of woman, her fragrant hair, jewel eyes, berry lips, and silver limbs. In the deserts and holy cities of Arabia, the troubadour motifs took form. Poets and philosophers spoke of adab as, in one phase, the ethic and etiquette of love. This tradition would pass through Egypt and Africa to Sicily and Spain, and thence to Italy and Provence, and hearts would break in rhyme and rhythm and many tongues. Hassan ibn Hani won the name of Abu Nuwas, father of the curl, from his abounding locks. Born in Persia, he found his way to Baghdad, became a favorite of Harun, and may have had with him one or two of the adventures ascribed to them in the 1,000 Nights and a Night. He loved wine, woman, and his songs, offended the caliph by too conspicuous toping, agnosticism, and lechery, was often imprisoned and often released, came by leisurely stages to virtue, and ended by carrying beads and the Koran with him everywhere. But the society of the capital liked best the hymns that he had written to wine and sin. "Come, Suleiman, sing to me, and the wine, quick, bring to me. While the flask goes twinkling round, pour me a cup that leaves me drowned with oblivion. Ne'er so nigh let the shrill muezzin cry. Accumulate as many sins as thou canst. The Lord is ready to relax his ire. When the day comes, forgiveness thou wilt find before a mighty king and gracious sire. And gnaw thy fingers, all that joy regretting which thou didst leave through terror of hellfire." The minor courts had their poets too, and Saif-ud-Dawla provided a place for one who, almost unknown to Europe, is reckoned by the Arabs as their best. His name was Ahmad ibn Hussein, but Islam remembers him as Al-Mutanabi, the pretender to prophecy. Born at Kufa in 915, he studied at Damascus, announced himself as a prophet, was arrested and released, and settled down at the Aleppo court. Like Abu Nuwas, he made his own religion and notoriously neglected to fast or pray or read the Koran. Though he denounced life as not quite up to his standards, he enjoyed it too much to think of eternity. He celebrated Saifu's victories with such zest and verbal artifice that his poems are as popular in Arabic as they are untranslatable into English. One couplet proved mortal to him. "I am known to the horse troop, the night and the desert's expanse, not more to paper and pen than to sword and the lance." Attacked by robbers, he wished to flee. His slave inopportunely reminded him of these swashbuckling verses. Al-Mutanabi resolved to live up to them, fought, and died of his wounds in 965. 8 years later, the strangest of all Arab poets, Abul-Ala al-Mari, was born at Al-Maratu near Aleppo. Smallpox left him blind at 4. Nevertheless, he took up the career of a student, learned by heart the manuscripts that he liked in the libraries, traveled widely to hear famous masters, and returned to his village. During the next 15 years, his annual income was 30 dinars, some $12 a month, which he shared with servant and guide. His poems won him fame, but as he refused to write encomiums, he nearly starved. In 1008 he visited Baghdad, was honored by poets and scholars, and perhaps picked up among the free thinkers of the capital some of the skepticism that spices his verse. In 1010 he went back to Al-Maratu, became rich, but lived to the end with the simplicity of a sage. He was a vegetarian à l'outrance, avoiding not only flesh and fowl, but milk, eggs, and honey as well. To take any of these from the animal world he thought was rank robbery. On the same principle he rejected the use of animal skins, blamed ladies for wearing furs, and recommended wooden shoes. He died at 84, and a pious pupil relates that 180 poets followed his funeral, and 84 savants recited eulogies at his grave. We know him now chiefly through the 1,592 short poems called, briefly, Luzumiyat, or Obligations. Instead of discussing woman and war like his fellow poets, Al-Mari deals boldly with the most basic questions. Should we follow revelation or reason? Is life worth living? Is there a life after death? Does God exist? Every now and then the poet professes his orthodoxy. He warns us, however, that this is a legitimate precaution against martyrdom, which was not to his taste. "I lift my voice to utter lies absurd, but speaking truth, my hushed tones scarce are heard." He deprecates indiscriminate honesty. "Do not acquaint rascals with the essence of your religion, for so you expose yourself to ruin." In simple fact, Al-Mari is a rationalist, agnostic pessimist. Some hope that an imam with prophet's gaze will rise and all the silent ranks amaze. Oh, idle thought! There's no imam but reason to point the morning and the evening ways. Shall we in these old tales discover truth, or are they worthless fables told to youth? Our reason swears that they are only lies, and reason's tree bears verity for truth. How oft, when young, my friends I would defame, if our religious faiths were not the same. But now my soul has traveled high and low, now all save love to me is but a name. He denounces the Moslem divines who make religion serve the pelf of man, who fill the mosque with terror when they preach, but conduct themselves no better than some who drink to a tavern tune. You have been deceived, honest man, by a cunning knave who preaches to the women. To his own sordid ends the pulpit he ascends, and though he disbelieves in resurrection, makes all his hearers quail whilst he unfolds a tale of last-day scenes that stun the recollection. The worst scoundrels, he thinks, are those who manage the holy places in Mecca. They will do anything for money. He advises his hearers not to waste their time in pilgrimage, and to be content with one world. The body nothing feels when soul is flown. Shall spirit feel, unbodied and alone? We laugh, but inept is our laughter. We should weep and weep sore, who are shattered like glass, and thereafter remolded no more. And he concludes, If by God's decree I shall be made into a clay pot that serves for ablutions, I am thankful and content. He believes in a God omnipotent and wise, and marveled at a physician who denies the Creator after having studied anatomy. But here, too, he raises difficulties. Our natures did not become evil by our choice, but by the fate's command. Why blame the world? The world is free of sin. The blame is yours and mine. Grapes, wine, and drinker, these are three. But who was at fault, I wonder, he that pressed the grapes, or he that sipped the wine? I perceive, he writes with Voltairean sarcasm, that men are naturally unjust to one another, but there is no doubt of the justice of him who created injustice. And he breaks out into the angry dogmatism of a Diderot. O fool, awake! The rights ye sacred hold are but a cheat contrived by men of old, who lusted after wealth and gained their lust, and died in baseness, and their law is dust. Offended by what seemed to him the lies and cruelties of men, Al-Mari became a pessimist recluse, the Timon of Islam. Since the evils of society are due to the nature of man, reform is hopeless. The best thing is to live apart, and to meet only a friend or two, to vegetate like some placid, half-solitary animal. Better yet is never to be born, for once born we must bear torment and tribulation until death yields us peace. Life is a malady whose one medicine is death. All come to die, alike householder and wanderer. The earth seeketh, even as we, its livelihood day by day apportioned. It eats and drinks of human flesh and blood. Meseemeth the crescent moon that shines in the firmament is death's curved spear, its point well sharpened, and splendor of breaking day a saber unsheathed by the dawn. We cannot escape these reapers ourselves, but we can, like good Schopenhauerians, cheat them of the children we might have begotten. If ye unto your sons would prove by act how dearly them ye love, then every voice of wisdom joins to bid you leave them in your loins. He obeyed his own counsel, and wrote for himself the pithiest, bitterest epitaph. My sire brought this on me, but I on none. We do not know how many Moslems shared the skepticism of Al-Mari. The revival of orthodoxy after his time served as a conscious or unconscious censor of the literature transmitted to posterity, and, as in Christendom, may mislead us into minimizing medieval doubt. Al-Mutanabi and Al-Mari marked the zenith of Arabic poetry. After them, the supremacy of theology and the silencing of philosophy drove Arabic verse into the insincerity, artificial passion, and flowering elegance of courtly and trivial lays. But at the same time, the resurrection of Persia and its self-liberation from Arab rule were stirring the nation to a veritable renaissance. The Persian tongue had never yielded to Arabic in the speech of the people. Gradually, in the 10th century, reflecting the political and cultural independence of the Tabarid, Samanid, and Ghaznavid princes, it reasserted itself as the language of government and letters, and became new or modern Persian, enriched itself with Arabic words, and adopted the graceful Arabic script. Persia now broke out in magnificent architecture and lordly poetry. To the Arab qasida, or ode, kita, or fragment, and ghazal, or love poem, the poets of Iran added the matnawi, or poetic narrative, and the rubai, the plural being rubaiyat, or quatrain. Everything in Persia, patriotism, passion, philosophy, pederasty, piety, now blossomed into verse. This efflorescence began with Rudagi, who died in 954, who improvised poetry, sang ballads, and played the harp at the Samanid court of Bokhara. There, a generation later, Prince Nu ibn Mansur asked the poet Dakiki to put into verse the Kodainama, or Book of Kings, wherein Danishwar, circa 651, had gathered the legends of Persia. Dakiki had written 1,000 lines when he was stabbed to death by his favorite slave. Firdausi completed the task and became the Homer of Persia. Abul Qasim Mansur, or Hassan, was born at Tus, near Mashhad, about 934. His father held an administrative post at the Samanid court and bequeathed to his son a comfortable villa at Baz, near Tus. Spending his leisure in antiquarian research, Abul Qasim became interested in the Kodainama and undertook to transform those prose stories into a national epic. He called his work Shahnameh, Book of the Shahs, and in the fashion of the time took a pen name, Firdausi, or Garden, perhaps from the groves of his estate. After 25 years of labor, he finished the poem in its first form and set out for Ghazni, possibly in 999, hoping to present it to the great and terrible Mahmud. An early Persian historian assures us that there were then 400 poets in constant attendance on Sultan Mahmud. It should have been an unsurpassable barrier, but Firdausi succeeded in interesting the vizier, who brought the immense manuscript to the Sultan's attention. Mahmud, says one account, gave the poet comfortable quarters in the palace, turned over to him reams of historical material, and bade him incorporate these in the epic. All variations of the story agree that Mahmud promised him a gold dinar, or $4.70, for each couplet of the revised poem. For an unknown time Firdausi labored. At last, circa 1010, the poem reached its final form in 60,000 couplets and was sent to the Sultan. When Mahmud was about to remit the promised sum, certain courtiers protested that it was too much, and added that Firdausi was a Shiite and Mutazilite heretic. Mahmud sent 60,000 silver dirhams, or $30,000. The poet, in anger and scorn, divided the money between a bath attendant and a sherbet seller, and fled to Herat. He hid for 6 months in a bookseller's shop until Mahmud's agents, instructed to arrest him, gave up the search. He found refuge with Shahriyar, prince of Shirzad, in Tabaristan. There he composed a bitter satire on Mahmud. But Shahriyar, fearful of the Sultan, bought the poem for 100,000 dirhams and destroyed it. If we may believe these figures and our equivalents, poetry was one of the most lucrative professions in medieval Persia. Firdausi went to Baghdad and there wrote a long narrative poem, Yusuf and Zuleika, a variant of the story of Joseph and Potiphar's wife. Then, an old man of 76, he returned to Tus. 10 years later, Mahmud, struck by the vigor of a couplet that he heard quoted, asked the author's name. When he learned that it was by Firdausi, he regretted his failure to reward the poet as promised. He dispatched to Firdausi a caravan carrying 60,000 gold dinars worth of indigo and a letter of apology. As the caravan entered Tus, it encountered the poet's funeral, possibly in 1020. The Shahnameh is one of the major works of the world's literature, if only in size. There is something noble in the picture of a poet putting aside trivial subjects and easy tasks and giving 35 years of his life to telling his country's story in 120,000 lines, far exceeding the length of the Iliad and the Odyssey combined. Here was an old man mad about Persia, enamored of every detail in its records, whether legend or fact. His epic is half finished before it reaches history. He begins with the mythical figures of the Avesta, tells of Gayamurt, the Zoroastrian Adam, and then of Gayamurt's mighty grandson, Jamshid, who reigned over the land 700 years. The world was happier because of him. Death was unknown, neither sorrow nor pain. But after a few centuries his heart was lifted up with pride, and he forgot whence came his weal. He beheld only himself on the earth, called himself God, and sent forth his image to be worshipped. At last we come to the hero of the epic, Rustam, son of the feudal noble Zal. When Rustam is 500 years old, Zal falls in love with a slave girl, and through her gives Rustam a brother. Rustam serves and saves 3 kings, and retires from military life at the age of 400. His faithful steed Raksh ages as leisurely, is almost as great a hero, and receives from Firdausi the affectionate attention bestowed by any Persian upon a fine horse. There are pretty love stories in the Shahnameh, and something of the troubadour's reverence for woman. There are charming pictures of fair women, one of the Queen Sudava, who was veiled that none might behold her beauty, and she went with the men as the sun marches behind a cloud. But in the case of Rustam, the love motif plays a minor part. Firdausi recognizes that the dramas of parental and filial love can be more affecting than those of sexual romance. Amid a distant campaign, Rustam has an amour with a Turkish lady, Tamina, and then loses track of her. She brings up their son, Sohrab, in sorrow and pride, telling the youth of his great but vanished father. In a war of Turks against Persians, son and sire, neither knowing the other, meet spear to spear. Rustam admires the courage of the handsome lad and offers to spare him. The boy disdainfully refuses, fights bravely, and is mortally wounded. Dying, he mourns that he has never yet seen his father Rustam. The victor perceives that he has slain his son. Sohrab's horse, riderless, regains the Turkish camp, and the news is brought to Sohrab's mother in one of the finest scenes of the epic. The strong emotion choked her panting breath. Her veins seemed withered by the cold of death. The trembling matrons hastened round her, mourned with piercing cries, till fluttering life returned. Then, gazing up distraught, she wept again, and frantic, seeing midst her pitying train the favourite steed, now more than ever dear, its limbs she kissed and bathed with many a tear. Clasping the male Sohrab in battle war, with burning lips she kissed it o'er and o'er. His martial robes she in her arms compressed, and like an infant strained them to her breast. It is a vivid narrative, moving rapidly from episode to episode, and finding unity only from the unseen presence of the beloved fatherland in every line. We, who have less leisure than men had before so many labor-saving devices were invented, cannot spare the time to read all these couplets and bury all these kings. But which of us has read every line of the Iliad, or the Aeneid, or the Divine Comedy, or Paradise Lost? Only men of epic stomach can digest these epic tales. After 200 pages, we tire of Rustam's victories over demons, dragons, magicians, Turks. But we are not Persians. We have not heard the sonorous roll of the original verse. We cannot be moved as Persians are, who in a single province have named 300 villages after Rustam. In 1934, the educated world of Asia, Europe, and the Americas joined in commemorating the millennial anniversary of the poet whose massive book has been for 1,000 years the bulwark of the Persian soul. 7. Art. This section is particularly indebted to the Survey of Persian Art, edited by Arthur Upham Pope, and especially to the chapters written by himself. His devoted work in this field, like that of James H. Breasted on Egypt, is an enduring monument of meticulous scholarship and discriminating philanthropy. When the Arabs invaded Syria, their sole art was poetry. Muhammad was believed to have forbidden sculpture and painting as accomplices of idolatry, and music, rich silks, gold and silver ornaments as Epicurean degeneracy. And though all these prohibitions were gradually overcome, they almost confined Moslem art in this period to architecture, pottery, and decoration. The Arabs themselves, so recently nomads or merchants, had no mature facility in art. They recognized their limitations and employed the artists and artisans, adapted the art forms and traditions of Byzantium, Egypt, Syria, Mesopotamia, Iran, and India. The Dome of the Rock at Jerusalem and the Mosque of Walid II at Damascus were purely Byzantine, even in their decoration. Farther east, the old Assyrian and Babylonian tile decoration and current Armenian and Nestorian church forms were adopted. And in Persia, after much destruction of Sasanian literature and art, Islam saw the advantages of the column cluster, the pointed arch, the vault, and those styles of floral and geometrical ornament which finally flowered into the arabesque. The result was no mere imitation, but a brilliant synthesis that justified all borrowing. From the Alhambra in Spain to the Taj Mahal in India, Islamic art overrode all limits of place and time, laughed at distinctions of race and blood, developed a unique and yet varied character, and expressed the human spirit with a profuse delicacy never surpassed. Moslem architecture, like most architecture in the Age of Faith, was almost entirely religious. The dwellings of men were designed for brief mortality, but the house of God was to be, at least internally, a thing of beauty forever. Nevertheless, though the remains are scant, We hear of bridges, aqueducts, fountains, reservoirs, public baths, fortresses, and turreted walls built by engineer architects who in the first centuries after the Arab conquest were in many cases Christian, but in after centuries were predominantly Muslim. The Crusaders found excellent military architecture at Aleppo, Baalbek, and elsewhere in the Islamic East, learned there the uses of machicolated walls, and took from their foes many an idea for their own incomparable castles and forts. The Alcazar at Seville and the Alhambra at Granada were fortresses and palaces combined. Of Umayyad palaces little survives except a country house at Qusayr Amra, in the desert east of the Dead Sea, where the ruins show vaulted baths and frescoed walls. The palace of Adud al-Dawla at Shiraz, we are assured, had 360 rooms, one for each day of the year, each painted in a unique color combination. One of its largest rooms was a library 2 stories high, arcaded and vaulted. There was no book on any subject, says an enthusiastic Moslem, of which there was not here a copy. Scheherazad's descriptions of Baghdad mansions are fiction, but suggest an ornate magnificence of internal decoration. Rich men had villas in the country as well as homes in the city. Even in the city they had formal gardens. But around their villas these gardens became paradises, parks with springs, brooks, fountains, tiled pool, rare flowers, shade, fruit, and nut trees, and usually a pavilion for enjoying the open air without the glare of the sun. In Persia there was a religion of flowers. Rose festivals were celebrated with sumptuous displays. The roses of Shiraz and Firuzabad were world famous. Roses with 100 petals were gifts grateful to a caliph or a king. The houses of the poor were then, as they are now, rectangles of sun-dried brick cemented with mud, and roofed with a mixture of mud, stalks, branches, palm leaves, and straw. Better homes had an interior court with a water basin, perhaps a tree, sometimes a wooden colonnade and cloister between court and rooms. Houses rarely faced or opened upon the street. They were citadels of privacy, built for security and peace. Some had secret doors for sudden escape from arrest or attack, or for the inconspicuous entry of a paramour. In all but the poorest houses there were separate quarters for the women, occasionally with their own court. Rich houses had a complicated suite of bathrooms, but most dwellings had no plumbing. Water was carried in, waste was carried out. Fashionable homes might have 2 stories, with a central living room rising to a dome, and a second-story balcony facing the court. All except the poorest houses had at least one window grill, mashrabiyah, a lattice of woodwork to let in light without heat, and allow the occupants to look out unseen. These grills were often elegantly carved, and served as models for the stone or metal screens that adorned the palace or the mosque. There was no fireplace. Heat was provided by charcoal-burning portable braziers. Walls were of plaster, usually painted in many colors. Floors were covered with hand-woven rugs. There might be a chair or 2, but the Moslem preferred to squat. Near the wall, on 3 sides of the room, the floor was raised a foot or so, forming a diwan, and was furnished with cushions. There were no specific bedrooms. The bed was a mattress which during the day was rolled up and placed in a closet, as in modern Japan. Furniture was simple, some vases, utensils, lamps, and perhaps a niche for books. The Oriental is rich in the simplicity of his needs. For the poor and pious Moslem it was enough that the mosque itself should be beautiful. It was built with his labor and dirhams. It gathered up his arts and crafts and laid them like a rich carpet at Allah's feet. And that beauty and splendor all men might enjoy. Usually the mosque was situated near the marketplace, easily accessible. It was not always impressive from without. Except for its facade, it might be indistinguishable from, even physically attached to, the neighboring structures. It was rarely built of any more lordly material than stucco-faced brick. Its functions determined its forms: a rectangular court to hold the congregation, a central basin and fountain for ablutions, a surrounding arcaded portico for shelter, shade, and schools, and on the side of the court facing Mecca, the mosque proper, usually an enclosed section of the portico. It, too, was rectangular, allowing the worshippers to stand in long lines, again facing Mecca. The edifice might be crowned with a dome, almost always built of bricks, each layer projecting a bit inward beyond the layer beneath, with a surface of plaster to conceal the deviations. As in Sasanian and Byzantine architecture, the transition from rectangular base to circular dome was mediated by pendentives or squinches. More characteristic of mosque architecture was the minaret, from minara, a lighthouse. Probably the Syrian Muslims developed it from the Babylonian ziggurat, and the bell tower of Christian churches. The Persian Moslems took the cylindrical form from India, and the African Moslems were influenced in its design by the four-cornered pharos, or lighthouse of Alexandria. Perhaps the four-corner towers of the old temple area at Damascus influenced the form. In this early period, the minaret was simple and mostly unadorned. Only in the following centuries would it achieve the lofty slenderness, fragile balconies, decorative arcades, and faience surfaces that would lead Ferguson to call it the most graceful form of tower architecture in the world. The most brilliant and varied decoration was reserved for the interior of the mosque. Mosaics and brilliant tiles on floor and mihrab, exquisite shapes and hues of glass in windows and lamps, rich carpets and prayer rugs on the pavement, facings of colored marble for the lower panels of the walls, lovely friezes of Arabic script running round mihrabs or cornices, delicate carvings of wood or ivory or graceful molding of metal in doors, ceilings, pulpits, and screens. The pulpit itself, or minbar, was of wood carefully carved and inlaid with ebony or ivory. Near it was the dika, a reading desk supported by small columns and holding the Koran. The book itself, of course, was a work of calligraphic and miniaturist art. To show the Qibla, or direction of Mecca, a niche was cut into the wall, possibly in imitation of the Christian apse. This mihrab was elaborated until it became almost an altar or chapel, and all the skill of Moslem artists was deployed to make it beautiful with faience or mosaic, floral or scriptural moldings or reliefs, and colorful patterns in brick, stucco, marble, terracotta, or tile. We probably owe this splendor of ornament to the Semitic prohibition of human or animal forms in art. As if in compensation, the Moslem artist invented or adopted an overflowing abundance of non-representational forms. He sought an outlet first in geometrical figures: line, angle, square, cube, polygon, cone, spiral, ellipse, circle, sphere. He repeated these in 100 combinations and developed them into swirls, guilloches, reticulations, entrelacs, and stars. Passing to floral forms, he designed in many materials wreaths, vines, or rosettes of lotus, acanthus, or palm tendrils or leaves. In the 10th century he merged all these in the arabesque, and to them all, as a unique and major ornament, he added the Arabic script. Taking usually the Kufic characters, he lifted them vertically, or expanded them laterally, or dressed them in flourishes and points, and turned the alphabet into a work of art. As religious prohibitions slackened, he introduced new motifs of decoration by representing the birds of the air, the beasts of the field, or strange composite animals that dwelt only in his whimsical fantasy. His flair for adornment enriched every form of art: mosaic, miniature, pottery, textiles, rugs. And in nearly every case the design had the disciplined unity of a dominant form or motif developed from center to border, or from beginning to end, as in the elaboration of a musical theme. No material was thought too obdurate for such ornament. Metal, wood, brick, stucco, stone, terracotta, glass, tile, and faience became the vehicles of such a poetry of abstract forms as no art, not even the Chinese, had ever achieved before. So illuminated, Islamic architecture raised in Arabia, Palestine, Syria, Mesopotamia, Persia, Transoxiana, India, Egypt, Tunisia, Sicily, Morocco, and Spain, an endless chain of mosques in which masculine strength of outward form was always balanced by feminine grace and delicacy of interior ornament. This book is continued at this point on the other side of this cassette. Please reverse or turn the cassette over now.